you the floor, or should I say the little pixie?
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for being here, and thank you to Jean-Francois for inviting me. I think he first got in touch more than a year and a half ago, and at the time I thought, oh, wonderful, I get to go for a trip to Paris, and that has transmogrified into talking to you from this quiet corner of my bedroom. But I'm still really delighted to be here and to be sort of beaming in virtually to spend an hour or so talking about dead people together. I'm going to begin with this quotation printed in a London periodical in 1842. Were we seriously asked what part of Christendom, whether in remoter ages or comparatively modern times, was most troubled with supernatural horrors, we should without doubt or hesitation answer Scotland. For a long series of generations, there was not a castle, tower, hall, or cottage, nay, not even a herd shieling, barn, stable, or other outhouse, whether ruinous or in repair, throughout the whole kingdom, untenanted by one or more of these disembodied gentry a single night. Departed spirits frequented the land in such multitudes that thousands upon thousands of them could not find house room, but were fain to live unsheltered in the open air. And after the evening twilight, they were to be met with anywhere and everywhere. So this sketch promoted a concept of Scotland that would have been familiar to English readers, a nation replete with Gothic terrors in which both domestic and outdoor spaces were subject to spectral intrusion. The anonymous authors describe a sort of cartoonish scene. Ghosts are gibbering in churchyards, airing themselves at crossroads, and lounging about suspicious places. And I think this is a sort of reputation that's come to be associated with Scotland, this idea that it was a very haunted place. But it's not an idea that we should just accept uncritically. I'll argue today that visions of this haunted Scottish landscape are not actually ancient, as the authors here imply. They attained this cultural prominence only in the late 18th and 19th centuries. In this period, ghosts, and particularly Highland ghosts, become representatives of a specifically Scottish past, stalking a specifically Scottish landscape. Accounts of hauntings had traditionally advanced particular agendas, but amid the upheaval of industrialisation and clearance in Scotland, ghost stories more than ever upheld complex political undertones. So I'll begin, first of all, by saying something about the history of ghosts prior to the 18th century. In his Christianity in the West, Jean Bossy writes that unlike the modern ghost, the traditional ghost was personal, not real. He haunted people, not places. Bossy rather overstates the case, but it is true that most medieval and early modern Scottish stories told of ghosts who appeared to specific individuals, usually friends or relatives, on particular business. Ghosts confirmed the reality of the afterlife, revealed murders, and ensured that their lands and monies were properly distributed after their death. And the haunting was temporarily constrained. The ghost departed for good when its business was resolved. Ghosts served generally as religious ambassadors. They came back with moral messages, so they couldn't linger indefinitely. Their proper place was in the world beyond. In Scotland in the Middle Ages, there circulated both stories of spirits returning from purgatory and stories of revenants or violent risen corpses, sort of modern-day zombies. I'll just tell you one of my favourite medieval Scottish stories. It's recorded in the 1470s by the chronicler Blind Harry. Blind Harry compiled a history of one of Scotland's best-known warriors, the valiant William Wallace, who fought against the English. And Harry recounted one story of how Wallace and 16 of his followers were fleeing from an English army. They hadn't got very far when one of the men, Forden, declared that he was too tired to go any further. For Wallace, this was proof enough that he was a traitor. He drew his sword and sliced off Forden's head. Wallace and his remaining followers then proceeded to their stronghold at Gask Hall in Perthshire. But when they arrived, they heard blaring horns. Wallace sent 2 of his men out to investigate, and they didn't come back. He dispatched 2 more, and the same thing happened. And then, in the true fashion of a sort of horror film protagonist, he keeps sending his men out 2 by 2. None of them come back, and the sound of the blaring horns just gets louder, until eventually he realizes he has to go out himself. So he does, and then he's greeted with this horrifying sight. Forden, risen from the dead, bearing his own decapitated head. And there follows this cartoonish fight. Forden hurls his head at Wallace. Wallace catches it and throws it back. And then Wallace, being aghast, charges up some stairs, jumps down 15 feet and runs away along a riverbank. And as he glances back, he sees Forden holding aloft this great rafter, having set his stronghold on fire. Now, medieval theologians were commonly uncertain about the orthodoxy of stories of the returning dead. And in this case, Harry underlined that the supposed ghost was actually the devil imitating Forden. He drew here on an idea from Dante that the devil could seize the body of traitors who died without repenting. However, elsewhere in his account of Wallace, Harry proved himself more ready to entertain the possibility that the dead might return. So he wrote also of a monk who died around the same time as Wallace and came back as a ghost to one of his brethren. He reported that he was coming from purgatory and that he had seen Wallace die, arrive, and pass very swiftly into heaven, despite, or perhaps because of, all of the Englishmen he had killed. In this case, the ghost was used to assert a political message about the righteousness of Wallace's fight against the English, and Harry didn't include any disclaimers about diabolic trickery. So the ghost here did advance a pro-Scottish agenda, but it wasn't a distinctively Scottish figure, this monk from purgatory. Ghosts in the Middle Ages or the 16th or 17th centuries were not generally tied to aspects of the Scottish scenery, and they did not tend to be particularly distinctive in their forms. They were very similar generally to English ghosts or to French ghosts or ghosts from various other parts of Europe. So the Reformation, of course, broke out in 1517. Scotland became a Protestant country in 1560. And in this atmosphere of religious turmoil, the question of whether or not dead souls might return took on new significance. Protestants rejected purgatory, with the 39 Articles of the Church of England terming it a fond thing vainly invented. And for most Protestants, this also meant that the dead could not come back. The general line was that nobody would ever be allowed to leave hell, and nobody would ever want to leave heaven, so there was nowhere for ghosts to return from. Prominent 16th century theologians, most notably the Swiss cleric Ludwig Lavater, argued that ghosts were deceptions. Sometimes they were tricks by the devil, sometimes hallucinations inspired by drunkenness or melancholy, sometimes pantomimes by fraudulent Catholics. In Scotland, this sceptical position was reinforced by King James VI, who wrote in his 1597 Demonology that no good spirits had appeared on earth since biblical times. And this theological discourse changed the kinds of apparition stories that were recorded. Stories of haunted houses circulated. The famed Scottish reformer John Knox was among those who was said to have exorcised a haunted house. But the blame for these hauntings was usually placed on demons, and sometimes the witches who were thought to summon them. Very few stories of the returning dead survive from the century and a half following the Reformation. This is in contrast to France, where as Caroline Carlyle has shown, the development of print culture and social upheaval generally gave ghosts new social purposes. In Scotland, people probably did tell stories of ghosts. Ballads, recorded most often in the 19th century, hint that there was an established oral tradition of accounts of dead souls coming back, usually to reveal murders or to tell their loved ones to stop grieving for them. But educated Protestants showed a marked reluctance to actually write down ghost stories. This changed somewhat in the late 17th century, when ghosts had a kind of revival. So, of course, this was a period of rapid philosophical development. Cartesian dualism became dominant in Scottish universities and was thought by some ministers and theologians to undermine the importance of spiritual forces by dividing the universe into just mind and matter. Even more controversial were Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza, who proposed more radically materialist visions of the universe. And in this context, some scholars began to worry that society would turn to atheism. Ghosts were valuable ammunition in the campaign against unbelief. They demonstrated the reality of separate souls and existence after death. In 1685, the Glasgow natural philosopher George Sinclair published a work colourfully entitled Satan's Invisible World Discovered. This book used stories of witches, ghosts, and other supernatural entities to combat the supposed atheist threat. And Sinclair wrote, "There are a monstrous rabble of men who, following the Hobbesian and Spinozian principles, slight religion and undervalue the scripture, because there is such an express mention of spirits and angels in it, which their thick and plumbeous capacities cannot conceive. Whereupon they think that all contained in the universe comes under the notion of things material and bodies only, and consequently no God, no devil, no spirit, no witch." So for Sinclair, the supernatural stories that he reproduced were a way to combat this sort of atheistical position. The prominent Presbyterian minister Robert Woodrow took a similar vein and reported stories that were very specifically targeted at combating unbelief. Woodrow was working especially in the early 18th century, so in 1729 he recorded a case that he said was really believed at Edinburgh. A girl sprained her arm at a dance in the Edinburgh Assembly, after which her health deteriorated rapidly. Her brother, who was a youth about 17, very rakish and loose in principles, tried to cheer her up with music and dancing. The girl protested that she wanted to remain serious to prepare for death, but her brother scoffed and declared, "Girl, when thou dies, if there be anything in those dreams of an afterlife, come back and tell me. I believe none of that priestcraft." The girl did die, and subsequently terrified her brother by returning to him, leaving him running like one distempered to his father. Stories like this stood as a warning to those who might doubt the promises of scripture or demonstrate too keen an appetite for dancing. However, this attempt to marshal ghosts into an anti-atheist army was short-lived. By the mid-1730s, nobody as respectable as Sinclair or Woodrow was interested in publishing ghost stories. Enlightenment culture was by no means hostile to supernatural forces generally, at least in Scotland. David Hume proffered a scathing critique of miracles, but he was roundly rebuked. Most thinkers continued to stress the authority of scripture, which allowed for the possibility of supernatural intervention on earth. Ghosts, however, were dismissed as a superstition within high intellectual culture. Ghost belief was associated especially with women and with the lower classes. Nurses and maidservants, who usually fell into both categories, were singled out for particular criticism. Writing in the 1790s, Elizabeth Muir of Caldwell declared that from about the mid-18th century, nurses were routinely turned away if they showed any inclination to poison their young charges' minds with stories of witches or ghosts. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the most common way to discredit ghost stories was to recast ghosts as demons. But as the Enlightenment progressed, there was a fresh emphasis on the idea that ghosts might be figments of the imagination, whether caused by temporary disturbances of the brain or tricks of the vision. Another possibility was that ghosts were all in the stomach. The Scottish physician David Brewster attributed one woman's spectral illusions to a disordered state of the digestive organs. This notion was memorably echoed in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol from 1843, in which Ebenezer Scrooge declares to Marley's ghost, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." But at the same time, ghosts took on new cultural importance in other arenas. The development of the printing press and the 1603 Union of Crowns, which united England and Scotland under a single monarch, had allowed for more interaction between the two nations. The flip side was a growing perception that English language and culture were threatening to erode Scots and Scottish traditions. The 1707 Union, by which Scotland lost its independent parliament, only heightened these concerns. It became fashionable to spurn rustic Scottish tastes and turns of phrase in favour of English equivalents, and collections of Scotticisms were printed, advising Scots on words or phrases to avoid in refined company. So, for example, according to a collection attributed to David Hume, this foodstuff here should be termed bread and butter, rather than butter and bread, which is what your vulgar sort of Scots would say. In this context, poets, including Alan Ramsay, Robert Fergusson, and Robert Burns, contested this cultural imperialism through vernacular explorations of Scottish tradition, sometimes harnessing ghosts as spokespeople. So Robert Fergusson's The Ghaists, a Kirkyard Eclogue from 1773, describes a conversation between the ghosts of two Edinburgh men, George Heriot and George Watson. They meet in a graveyard to enjoy their nightly freedom before the cockcrow sends them back to their tombs, and together they mourn the union with England. One of them declares, "Black be the day that heir to England's ground Scotland was eked by the union's bond." And they foretell Scotland's downfall. "Ah, Caledon, the land I yence held dear, sair main mak I for thy destruction near. So I moan grievously for your destruction." The ghosts are themselves powerless to alter Scotland's course, but they do debate the possibility of engaging some ghost who deals with the devil in order to cause meteorological chaos till Scotland's out of reach of England's power. The implication here is that truly patriotic Scots should stop at nothing to reclaim their national independence. Robert Burns also made use of ghost-like spirits to reflect on the changing nature of Scottish society, again with reference to English incursion. The power of the old Scottish aristocracy declined in the 18th century as the professional classes expanded. Burns's The Briggs of Ayr from 1787 presents an argument between the spirits of two bridges. So the old brig symbolises a bygone generation. Old brig appeared of ancient Pictish race, the very wrinkles Gothic in his face. The new brig, on the other hand, represents a modern Scotland, clad in English finery. Newbrig was busket in a braw new coat that he at London frae an Adams got. The new brig mocks the old brig as an ugly Gothic hulk, and insults the gaunt, ghastly, ghaist-alluring edifices of its architecture. And the old brig retorts, conceited gowk puffed up with windy pride, and proceeds to criticise the corky-headed, graceless gentry who had come to rule and ruin the country. The old brig describes how the great folk of the past are cursing the present day base, degenerate race. Now, Robert Burns's approach is more even-handed than Robert Ferguson's. In his poem, both bridges are allowed their say, and their argument is ultimately overshadowed by the appearance of spirits of nature, benevolence, courage, learning, and peace. Burns thus presents a way to move forward and to reconcile the conflicting forces within Scottish society. But the Brigs of Ayr, like Ferguson's ghaists, a kirkyard eclogue, uses ghosts, notably vernacular Scots-speaking ghosts, to explore this discord between Scotland's independent past and North British present. In the writing of poets like Burns and Ferguson, ghosts become politicised to a new degree and sort of speak with new resonances. Around the same time, the development of Gothic and Romantic themes within literature further reconfigured the figure of the ghost. The birth of Scottish Gothic is often located in the early 19th century, with the work of Walter Scott and James Hogg especially. But elements of the Gothic aesthetic could be found in poetry from the mid-18th century. So, The Grave, a 1743 blank verse poem by Robert Blair, featured a host of ghosts patrolling a ceremony. In grim array the grisly spectres rise, grin horrible and obstinately sullen, pass and repass, hushed as the foot of night. As Eric Paraso notes, 18th century poetry increasingly shaped how people thought about death, usurping the traditional authority of religious texts. Blair was a minister, and The Grave was a broadly religious work, but his aimless ghosts who met together in this graveyard to collectively mourn the joys of life now lost offered a wholly unchristian view of the state of departed souls. In subsequent decades, other authors similarly divorced ghosts from particular religious significance and weaved them into the fabric of caliginous landscapes. So James Beattie's 1758 Ode to Peace described tenebrous ruins where ghosts glare horrid from the sylvan gloom. Or in his 1748 Adventures of Roderick Random, the novelist Tobias Smollett had a character ruminate in evocative terms on the haunted nature of desolate buildings. I'll seek some lonely church or dreary hall where fancy paints the glimmering taper blue. It was a common folkloric notion that ghosts made flames burn blue. Where damp hangs mouldering on the ivied wall and sheeted ghosts drink up the midnight dew. These ghosts were very different from the kinds of ghosts that we encounter in the Middle Ages or the 16th, the 17th centuries. They haunt places, not people. They don't have any particular religious agenda or moral import. They are constitutive of the atmosphere. They reconceptualize everyday spaces and infuse them with a sense of melancholy that reflects on contemporary fears about death and what might follow it. The late 18th century also saw a particular surge of interest in Highland ghosts. Perceptions of the Highlands were changing dramatically over the course of the 18th century. The region had traditionally been presented as a dangerous place, peopled by barbarians. This is an image of Highland warriors. In 1535, Pedasvarva wrote that the wild Scots live in the manner of the Scythians. They are ignorant of the use of bread. When they are hungry, they outstrip a stag in swiftness of foot, overtake it and kill it, and so sustain life. They eat the flesh raw, only squeezing out the blood. The English antiquarian William Camden's 1586 Britannia described the Highlanders as wild, warlike, cruel, hateful, and inclined to robbery and theft. This stereotype was reinforced in 18th century England by the Jacobite uprisings. However, after the last uprising of 1745 had been quelled and the Highlanders had ceased to pose a genuine threat to British stability, their warlike qualities came to be perceived in a more positive light. From the start of the 7 Years' War in 1756 up to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, more than 48,300 men were recruited from the Highlands and Islands to serve in regiments of the British Army. In 1766, William Pitt defended the recruitment of this hardy and intrepid race of men from the mountains of the north. The Highland soldier hero became a recognised trope, visited and explored in literature and in poetry. This was enhanced by the emerging Enlightenment conception of the noble savage. Furthermore, as roads were improved, tourism to the Highlands expanded. The 1780s and the 1790s in particular saw burgeoning numbers of visitors to the region, partly inspired by Samuel Johnson's account of his 1775 tour of the Western Isles. There was a growing aesthetic appreciation for Highland scenery. So when Edmund Burt visited in the 1720s as part of road building projects, he was completely unimpressed by the landscape. He described it as being all horrid gloom, a dismal, gloomy brown drawing upon a dirty purple. The mountains were monstrous excrescencies. And the scenery, he asserted, was most of all disagreeable when the heath or the heather is in bloom. Daniel Defoe, visiting the Highlands from England, also in the mid-1720s, called the mountains hideous. And there was a sort of common refrain in English texts that if you took an Englishman up to the Highlands and blindfolded him, spun him round and removed the blindfold, he'd be utterly terrified and probably sort of faint on the spot. However, by the later 18th century, the landscape had been reframed into something romantic and awe-inspiring. So in 1869, Thomas Pennant declared that the pass into the Highlands is awfully magnificent and described the mountains as a scene of horrible grandeur. Walter Scott is reported to have said that if I did not see the heather at least once a year, I think I should die. This coincided with the development of landscape, resulted in the circulation of sublime Highland scenes. Here's an interesting example of how artwork of the Highlands evolved. So at the top here, we've got a 1747 view of Strath Tay by Paul Sandby. At the bottom is a 1780 engraving made after the same image. So you can just take a moment to play spot the difference. You can see that in the 1780 version, the mountains are bigger, more dramatic, more sort of looming as a presence. The tree too is a bit more kind of brooding. We've got these sort of sultry clouds have appeared in the sky. The landscape in general is kind of darker in a sort of more dramatic fashion. And it's a little hard to see, but just at the bottom, slightly over to the left, and some sheep that's been introduced to the scene just to reinforce its sort of Highland qualities. So visions of the Highlands were evolving, and ghosts similarly evolved to epitomize a sort of newly idealized view of the region. So particularly important in the reframing of Highland ghosts was the epic cycle of Ossian poetry, which was published in the 1760s to widespread acclaim. The poetry was supposedly discovered and translated by James Macpherson of Badenoch. Macpherson claimed that the poems were the work of a legendary bard called Ossian, and that they demonstrated the existence of an ancient Celtic civilization on par with ancient Greece and Rome. Modern scholars agree that the poems were in fact sort of composed and assembled by Macpherson himself, based on Gaelic and Irish ballads. In the 18th and the early 19th centuries, some public figures did question the authenticity of the poetry, but this didn't prevent it from becoming an international sensation. Napoleon was a particularly keen fan. This painting was commissioned to furnish his reception room at the Palace of Malmaison. Macpherson's poetry offered this seductive vision of a lost Gaelic civilization, and the world he presented was a society on the brink of dissolution, a narrator recalling bygone glories. Ossian was a blind bard who was the last surviving member of his race. This world was haunted both metaphorically and literally. The spectral remains of past heroes flitted through the landscape, occasionally manifesting to offer counsel or foretell calamity. And they exuded a sense of loss. One ghost appeared with eyes like two decaying flames. In another case, the warrior Cuchulainn was visited by a departed ally with a feeble voice. Surmising that the ghost wished to dissuade him from going into battle, Cuchulainn responded scornfully, "How art thou changed, chief of Lara? Thou art not Calmar's ghost. His arm was like the thunder of heaven." The Ossian poetry was instrumental in developing this vision of Highland glens populated by wistful, enfeebled phantoms, the remains of Celtic warriors, now broadly powerless. And as with the ghosts of Ferguson and Burns, Macpherson's ghosts can be read politically, in this case particularly as a response to the failure of the Jacobite uprisings. Macpherson was himself a Highlander. His clan was involved in the 1745 uprising. And after the failure of the uprising, the government passed measures designed to subdue the Highlanders. Road building and mapping projects made the area more accessible. Government garrisons were built, and more English-speaking schools were founded to try and loosen the cultural grip of Gaelic. The power of clan chiefs was curtailed. Traditional dress was banned. So the poems of Ossian harken back to a sort of romantic Celtic past, albeit a largely fabricated one, and reinforced Gaelic identity in the face of governmental suppression. Macpherson's ghosts represented the authority of age and of a venerable past, but they were powerless to alter the sorry path of the future. The Ossian poetry draws on the kind of melancholic themes that we've seen emerging from early Gothic poetry and diverts them into the mourning for a loss of a greater Scotland. In the 19th century then, folklore took off as a discipline. So the statistical accounts of Scotland, which were compiled first in 1791 to 99, secondly in 1834 to 35, interspersed geographical and topographical analysis with snippets about local beliefs. And there was a great proliferation of works about traditional customs and legends. And these works explored ghosts from all parts of the country. Robert Chambers was instrumental in popularising various Edinburgh ghost stories, including what have become modern-day ghost tour staples about the ghost of the warlock Major Thomas Weir, who supposedly haunts Edinburgh's Grassmarket area, and the ghost of George Bloody Mackenzie, a persecutor of the Covenanters, who supposedly stalks Edinburgh's Greyfriars Kirkyard and beats up unsuspecting tourists. But again, it was the Highlands that attracted his special attention. Writing in the 1820s, the geologist John McCulloch declared that all the world has heard of Highland ghosts and superstitions. He argued that ghosts were particularly well suited to the wild rocks, dark lakes, and gloomy caverns of the Highlands. The folklorist Anne McVicar Grant similarly correlated the supposed superstitious imaginations of the Highlanders with the wildness of the scenery. So these kind of accounts reinforced the idea that ghosts most often haunted the landscape rather than returning to particular individuals. Further, antiquarian accounts from this period stressed the peculiarly Highland characteristics of ghosts from the region. So first of all, they frame ghosts as warlike. The statistical account of 1791 to 9 declared that in Kirkmichael, in the county of Banff, Aberdeenshire, ghosts were commonly thought to stalk around until they encountered mortals and then to engage them in furious combat. John McCulloch explained that Highland ghosts were voracious, thievish, and violent. They carried about weapons, particularly flails and cudgels, and they were apt to pull a man's hair and box his ears. Walter Scott, 1771 to 1832, wrote of a ghost called Lam Derg, who haunted the woods of Glenmore and Rothiemurchus and battled passers-by. Sadly, there aren't usually images of these ghosts supplied along with the texts, but this is a modern Japanese envisaging of the ghost of Lam Derg, looking wonderfully dramatic. Lam Derg was said to wear the array of an ancient warrior. One of his hands was covered in blood, and if he came across anybody passing through the woods, he would immediately challenge them to combat. According to Walter Scott, the northern champions of old were accustomed peculiarly to search for and delight in encounters with military spectres. Writing in the 1820s, William Grant Stewart, who also assembled these collections of folklore, combined depiction of fearsome past spectres with a reflection on present-day loss. So he declared that the ancient race of Highland ghosts were a set of stout, lusty, sociable ghosts. They were corporeal and material. They could be killed by weapons. They were also ill-natured and cruel and cared not a spittle for woman or child. A ghost would prowl about the country with the laudable intention of committing all the mischief in his power. In modern times, however, ghosts had become puny green worm-eaten effigies that stalk about our premises and, like the chameleon, feed upon the air. Their degeneracy, from their ancient majesty of person and chivalry of habits, Stuart added, mirrored that of human men. So in emphasizing ghosts' martial abilities, these authors recalled stereotypes of invincible Highland warriors. Anne McVicar Grant, 1755 to 1838, emphasised instead how ghosts reflected Highland traditions of clanship and kinship. She wrote that the dreams, the tales, and the songs of the Highlanders abounded with ghosts. These ghosts were moral, rational, and prudent, and they generally returned to loved ones, being conjured up by affection. So Grant has a different perspective on Highland ghosts that makes them less sort of violent or cruel, but she too is associating them with particular Highland characteristics. Her depiction of ghosts who return because they are conjured up by bonds of affection echoes her description of Highland culture generally. She underlined the importance of bonds of friendship and familial obligation, avowing that no Highlander ever once thought of himself as an individual. Another common motif in stories of Highland ghosts recorded in this period was the idea of the ghost who returned to his descendants when they died. So one of these stories concerned a ghost called Hugh of the Little Head, who haunted a clan on the island of Mull. Robert Chambers, a folklorist and printer in Edinburgh, explained in the 1820s that Hugh had died back in the misty past, according to a prophecy. On the eve of a battle, he was told by a witch-like figure that if his wife voluntarily brought him breakfast the next morning, the battle would go well. If he had to call for it, he would be killed. His ungenerous wife failed this trial of love, and Hugh met his death as predicted. Thereafter, his ghost attended his descendants at their deathbeds and escorted their spirits to the afterlife. He appeared at night, and he would ride furiously around the house, making a noise like the rattling of chains. Some authors explained that both Hugh and his horse were very small. This is how I always picture his horse, sort of clambering around the house. In particular, Hugh was said to have a very tiny head, earning him this epithet of Hugh of the Little Head. There were also other traditions. So McCulloch said that he was a giant, but he lost his head in warfare, and another one, maybe a smaller one, sprang up in its place. These stories, of course, had fantastical elements, but the theme of ancestor protection that they underlined drew on real-world structures within Highland society, and again sort of emphasised uniquely Highland characteristics. The folklorists recording these stories intended them to be interesting rather than edifying. Their own position was sceptical, and there was an implicit assumption that their readers shared this scepticism. Ghosts were things other people believed in. Introducing one ghost story, the English antiquary Francis Groves declared, "As the relation will enliven the dullness of antiquarian disquisition, I will here relate it, as it was told to me by an honest woman," this was a Scottish woman, "who, I will be sworn from her manner, believed every syllable of it." The story was a passing entertainment for him and his readers. The storyteller's credulity, exaggerated in Groves's retelling, was both amusing and bemusing to him. Ghost stories fashioned an alternative, mystical, unenlightened Scotland that could be marketed as a sort of curiosity. The idea that Scotland was a particularly magical place can be traced back to the Middle Ages, but there was initially a kind of resistance to this reputation. When the Earl of Lauderdale sent supernatural stories to the English theologian Richard Baxter in 1659, he requested that Baxter did not print them, as they would make the disaffected jeer Scotland, which is the object of scorn enough already. Scotland was already thought to be backwards, to be superstitious, and in the 17th century there was an urge to escape this reputation. But this idea that Scotland was a magical place was taken up with new enthusiasm in the 19th century. In The Bride of Lammermoor, Walter Scott presented the story of an apparition with the statement that this could not be called a Scottish story unless it manifested a tinge of Scottish superstition. Increasingly, Highland ghosts became Scottish mascots, in line with the broader appropriation of Highland culture to represent Scotland as a whole. So William Grant Stewart began his survey of Highland ghosts by locating them in a national framework. So early as the days of Asean, ghosts have been at all times a plentiful commodity among the hills of Caledonia. Here, Highland ghosts were made to epitomise Scotland broadly. Similarly, a periodical declared, "The English cannot get up decent ghosts, because the English, made robust by those two excellent things, beer and beef, wax fat, and a fat ghost would be an absurdity. But the Scotchman, being gaunt and bony, hails the ghost as a man and a brother. The ghost steals on us from the mountain, the lake, the mist, the forest, the glen. Indeed, the ghost is the exclusive property of the Celtic race, and it is almost the only property that race has ever been able to retain, as the Irish in Ireland and the Scottish Highlanders can testify." So here the Scottishness of ghosts was underlined by their connections to scenery commonly associated with the Highlands. The romanticisation of Scotland coincided with rising visitor numbers, and in the 20th century, ghost tourism became a fully fledged element of the Scottish economy. Highland ghosts essentially were taken, repackaged, turned into something that was used to market Scotland as a whole. However, this surging interest in Scottish tradition coincided with the disruption of communities precipitated by enclosure and clearance. The Highlands were particularly heavily impacted. In the late 18th and the early 19th centuries, tens of thousands of people were forced from their homes as landlords turned the land over to sheep grazing or put in place other kinds of agricultural improvement. Arguably, ghost stories allowed Scots to maintain community traditions amid the upheaval of modernisation. So by telling stories of the supernatural, as Carl Bell suggests in a discussion of 19th century urban English communities' responses to environmental change, people encoded their surroundings with traditional law that resisted official reordering. There is some evidence that Scots used ghost stories to codify the environment. Writing in 1822, David Stewart of Garth explained that some Highlanders could give a connected and minutely accurate detail of the history, genealogy, feuds and battles of all the tribes and families in every district, and would support their stories by a reference to every remarkable stone, cairn, tree or stream within the district, connecting with each some kindred story of a fairy or ghost. Supernatural stories became, by this reading, a way to exert ownership over the landscape, a sort of endeavour that, during the time of clearance, was innately subversive. However, growing interest in haunted space and in Highland ghosts cannot be read as a straightforward act of resistance to change. The writers who recorded these stories of Scottish or Highland landscapes patrolled by violent ghosts were not necessarily opposed to modernisation. John McCulloch defended the clearances, arguing that the expansion of sheep farming was revolutionary. And we cannot be sure that the sort of printed accounts that the folklorists circulated accurately reflect the kinds of stories that were circulating orally within communities. In fact, pre-modern Gaelic literature rarely included ghosts. Gaelic stories did explore supernatural themes, but they usually focused on fairies or shape-shifting. There do not seem to have been ghosts of the Oceanic type in Macpherson's Gaelic sources. Derek S. Thompson notes at least one case where Macpherson added a ghost to the typically unsentimental Gaelic ballads. 17th century antiquarian stories of Highland apparitions, meanwhile, were generally about second sight or the ability to see the future through apparitions, not about ghosts. The lack of source material originating from within actual Highland communities makes it impossible to state for sure that antiquarian stories about warlike Highland ghosts were inventions of tradition. But it seems likely that at the very least, the antiquarians emphasised a particular kind of apparition story at the expense of others. So we can't see these stories of Highland ghosts as being actual innate to the Highlanders. With this in mind, it's worth thinking a bit further about the politics of haunted Highland landscapes. Recent scholarship has challenged the tendency to assume that stories of hauntings were innately subversive, and has problematised readings of them as acts of cultural resistance. So in her work on Native American ghosts, Renee Berglund notes that by forcing Native Americans from real territories into white imaginative spaces, the ghosting of Indians works to establish American nationhood. Emily Cameron makes a similar argument about Indigenous communities in Canada. Confining the Indigenous to the ghostly has the potential to reinscribe the interests of the powerful upon the meanings and memories of place. Peopling the Highlands with phantoms similarly romanticised depopulation, as inferred in the extract quoted above, which described ghosts as almost the only property the Celtic race has ever been able to retain, as the Scottish Highlanders can testify. Ghosts, one might be forgiven for reflecting, a rather poor compensation for the other properties lost to the Highlanders. It is notable too that even as Highland ghosts were depicted as warriors, they were impotent, whether because they were puny and worm-eaten or simply because they were presented sceptically. Ghost stories served to tie the Highlanders to the past. Ghosts and people alike were anachronisms. By this reading, conceptions of haunted Highland landscapes developed not so much as a counter-narrative to modernisation, but as supporting testimony. Stories of ghostly landscapes separated off a bygone Scotland as a cultural relic, rendering the voices of the past present but powerless, and justifying the impositions of agricultural improvement. So some conclusions which I'll offer rapidly. People have always told ghost stories, but the kinds of stories that have risen to particular cultural prominence have changed over time. In the medieval and the early modern periods, the stories that were foregrounded in Scotland usually had moral points. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, there was a particular drive to turn ghosts into religious propagandists, demonstrating the reality of spirits and an afterlife. These ghosts generally returned to people rather than to places, and there was nothing very distinctively Scottish about them. Late 18th and 19th century literary and antiquarian accounts transformed conceptions of ghosts, popularising a vision of mountains, hills and glens haunted by characteristically Celtic spectres. The Romantic project of nation building carved out a kind of cultural distinctiveness to which Scots clung in the 19th century and beyond. This cultural identity was based largely on myths, whether about tartan kilts and bagpipes or about ghosts. But it was nevertheless powerful. It allowed Scotland to maintain a separate character as memories of political independence receded and Scotland became more embroiled in the great British imperialist project. But this cultural identity was depoliticised. As Colin Kidd has argued, the kind of kitsch Gallic identity that emerged functioned as a tame accessory of British unionism and imperialism. Because they forced past and present into dialogue and encrypted local areas with traditional law, ghost stories constituted a language through which communities might debate and resist change. And certainly at times, ghosts were used to cast doubt on the Union as a project. But the spectres who came to haunt the Highlands, particularly in the 19th century, were largely impotent figures. Framed as quaint curiosities, ghosts made ineffective cultural critics. The emphasis on Scottish superstition served frequently to justify modernisation. Quaint representatives of an ancient and anachronistic Highland culture, ghosts became part of a broader narrative justifying the brutal remodelling of the region. Thank you. I shall